Welcome to the Rich, Young, and Powerful podcast. This is the place where we help average givers become everyday philanthropists. I'm your host, Andrew McNair, a financial commentator, author, nine-figure wealth manager, and philanthropist too. I'm going to show you how to give more, how to find more fulfillment, and help you impact the causes that you care about the most. Because when a giver gives more, they receive and become more. Today, I'm really excited about bringing on our special guest. Jen Wilkin is one of those authors, when you read it, you're like, wow, I wish I could get to know this person. And that's the whole really cool perk of having a podcast is you can say, hey, I read this book. I think other people, if they haven't read her work, they should. And you get to bring them on and have great conversations. And that's what I hope is in store for today as usual. So Jen Wilkin is a Bible teacher, author, and speaker. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Andrew.
Well, I'm glad you're here. There's so many books that you've read that I wish I could have time to unpack them all, but one I really want to focus on for today's episode is your book, None Like Him. And I think that will be just a perfect topic to talk about. Can you share with us a little bit about that book and what's the background for you writing that book?
Yeah, I actually never thought I would write any books. And so it's the surprise of my middle age that I became an author. And I've taught women the Bible for years. I'm around the 25 or 30 year mark now of doing that. And one of the principles I'm always trying to teach is that the Bible is a book about God. And pretty much anyone who reads the Bible would go, yeah, that's true. I think that's true. But the problem is what I see in the church so often is that though we would agree with that statement, we've actually been trained into a way of reading it that makes it about us. We're looking for self-knowledge from the scriptures primarily. And it's not that self-knowledge isn't in the scriptures. It's just that we come to it via the knowledge of God. Calvin says that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of self always go hand in hand. There is no true knowledge of self apart from the knowledge of God. But when I would tell people, hey, you need to read the Bible as a book about God, you need to be reading it to see what's true about him, what I pretty quickly discovered was that most of us have a very atrophied or undeveloped vocabulary around what is true about God. And in particular, this book, None Like Him, talks about God's incommunicable attributes, the things that are only true about God that don't become true of us. And those in particular, I find, don't get a lot of our attention. When we pray, we don't often extol God for these particular qualities. And so I wanted to bring them to light and give people a better imagination around them so that when they open their Bibles, they'd begin to see them emerge from the text as they were studying.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. When we go to the Word, oftentimes, especially early in our walk with the Lord, we'll go to Psalms and Proverbs and give me wisdom, give me, a cheer up because I need one. And It is a book about God. That is the theme. That's the theme of our life, and what it should be is to learn more about God. And that's a successful day when you get to know Him just a little bit more. But I try to read the Bible, and this really challenging is oftentimes, I'm looking for myself in the Bible, I'll just use the cross, which again, the cross is, God going to the cross, making a bridge and a way towards our salvation. And oftentimes I need to start looking at not only that He's ransomed for me there on the cross, but also I'm the one that nailed His hands into the wood. I'm the one that's yelling, crucify. And we don't like to see ourselves as the Pharisee, but oftentimes we're the prodigal brother in the story. So that is hard to do.
It can be hard. We do have a tendency to place ourselves in the role of the hero. And, we're called to be like Christ. So there are ways that we need to look at His example and become like Him. And actually, that's another book that I wrote, In His Image, where we talk about what it means to be formed in the image of God as we see it in Christ's life. And so His life and example. So they're very important. But I find that a lot of times we know we should become like Christ, but we don't recognize how wanting to become like God in ways that we're not built to be like him is causing us to worship idols. And so when you think about the idea that the knowledge of God and knowledge of self always go hand in hand, when I think about the fact that God is omniscient, that he holds all knowledge, it really changes my recognition of how much knowledge I hold. I'm not built to hold all knowledge. But there's probably a really good reason that I love my cell phone so much. It's because Google makes me feel like God. It makes me feel like I can hold all knowledge. And, when you see what that looks like in limited human form, when we aspire to omniscience, it turns into information overload. It turns into, there's all kinds of data out there about how depression and anxiety are caused by the more we're feeding our minds pieces of information that we either have no use for or that don't lead us to a decision point because they just crush our will to even make a decision. So I think that the incommunicable attributes in particular help us to recognize, the reason I love behaving this way or can't break this habit is because there's something about it that is promising me that I can be like God in a way that I'm not designed to be.
Yep, you're exactly right. And what I thought was the book really expanded into some qualities of God that I've really never even thought about.
Mm-hmm.
As someone that was blessed enough to go to a private school in the first few years of my life, to be exposed to omniscient and omnipotent and some of these words that if you have been in church, grown up in church, maybe you've heard already before,
Mm-hmm.
but you brought in some other qualities either I didn't think about or worse, I thought about it and I said, I already know that. And then when I got into the chapter, I'm like, wow, I never thought about it like that. So None Like Him, great book. Everyone should be picking it up. But I want to steer our perspective looking through the lens of generosity in our finances. And you talk about reflecting or arrival, and how does understanding the difference between bearing the image of God but aspiring to be in some ways our own God affect how we handle our finances?
Well, I mean, you have to start, I think, back at the very beginning of the Bible to gain insight on this. And if you think about what the serpent promises to Eve in Genesis chapter 3, he says, God knows that on the day that you eat of the forbidden fruit, that you will become like him. And that's a really weird thing for the serpent to say to the woman, because the woman is already like him. In Genesis 1:26 and 27, we're told that the man and the woman are created in the image of God. So that means that whatever the lie of the forbidden fruit is, it's a lie that we can become like God in a way that we are not designed for. And so when you think about just the way that we think about our finances, probably the first place that we would look to in terms of God's incommunicable attributes would be that God is self-sufficient. There's really two that go together. He's self-existent, meaning that no one created him, but everything that we know is created by him. And self-existence is important for us when we think about stewardship, because if God made everything, then everything belongs to God. So that's a big deal because, and not only does it belong to him, but as its author, he has the right to determine its value and use. And so then everything that you and I have has been given to us to steward by a good and loving God. So self-existence, that matters. It's a question of origins. And since our origin and everything that we know originates in God, it means that he has the right to decide how his creation is used. And then self-sufficiency. God doesn't need anything. This is kind of an unpopular topic in current Christian culture, because we even have songs that are written that we sing on the weekends that say that God didn't want heaven without us. And so they brought heaven down, and that's not the worst lyric I've ever heard, but it does imply that there was something incomplete in God without us. That he had
there was something
need.
Missing out of his
I'll sometimes
self-existent, self-sufficient nature.
Yeah, God had an us-shaped hole in his heart. And he didn't. He does not save us. He doesn't set his love on us because he needs us. And that's actually really great news because the record would show that if he needed anything from us, we would let him down. But he doesn't need anything at all. And so, let's say, Andrew, that you took your young family to Six Flags Over Texas, which is not far from where I live. And it gets to be about lunchtime and your kids are hungry And so you walk up to a concession stand and you order 2 hot dogs and 2 Cokes and 2 bags of chips. And the person standing on the other side of the counter says, great, that'll be $86.25. And in that moment, what do?
Bring out my wallet because it sounds about right in the cost of things in Disney and Six Flags.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but the principle at play there is that the thing that we need is the thing by which we can be controlled.
Mm.
And so the fact that God doesn't need anything from me or from you or from anyone else or from anything in his creation is really good news, because it means that he can't be coerced. He can't be manipulated. And, but it is interesting, even as we talked about giving, a lot of people give with a low level intent to manipulate God. If I give, God will fill in the blank. But really, when you think of it in terms of stewardship, it all belongs to him. And then in terms of self-sufficiency, he doesn't actually need you in any way, shape, or form. It changes the way that we think about ownership, and it changes the way that we think about giving.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there even further. Is, we talk about and being made in his own image. And then Jesus, when he's with, the Pharisees that are calling him out about in the currency, does he pay the tax? Does he not pay the tax? And he says, what image does this bear?
Yeah.
And he says, well, Caesar. Yeah. What image do you bear? And
right.
I've been imprinted on you. I've given you just a glimpse of being created out of me. And so I think your point in the book about talking about reflect versus rival is we're so quick to, we would never say it, but we do try to rival God, and it does affect our finances in a big way. Rather than serving, we want to be served. Rather than give, we want to be given. And that is us acting like our own gods. And that is very dangerous if we approach our finances and the way we approach our careers in that way, is that we're not of service. I do want to dig deeper into what you talked about being self-existent. How does gloating that I'm self-made? A lot of entrepreneurs, business owners, I've probably been guilty at sometimes saying in my immaturity of saying, I'm self-made. How does that become an offense to a holy, self-existent God?
Well, I think it's what we would expect from the pagan, right? Someone who actually acknowledges that there is no higher point they can give glory to than themselves. But for the person who's united to Christ, there's no such thing as being self-made. I mean, truthfully, there's no such thing as being self-made at all. And that doesn't mean that our good efforts don't matter. It doesn't mean that there aren't real rewards that come from hard work. But we also know people who work really hard who don't see the same rewards as other people who are working hard. And so God decides who gets what ultimately. And then we do have an opportunity to show where our treasure is by the way that we respond to what we've been given. But I think we slip into that idolatry as soon as we begin to see ourselves as a terminus for God's good gifts instead of as a distribution point.
Well said. Self-sufficiency. I've had many times where I've posted a video talking about tithing and giving, and of course the people come out, the keyboard soldiers say, but why does God need my money? God does, if God is so self-sufficient, why would he need my money? And I always want to reply in the most graceful, merciful way. I don't always, but I try really hard. And I say, well, God doesn't need your money. You need to give. God doesn't need you to give. You need to give, because you will have this hole in your heart. God doesn't have a hole in our heart that he needs our worship. He can have the rocks worship him. But for us, we need to have a purpose. We need to have not only just a purpose, but a God-shaped hole in our heart that has to be filled. So to the self-sufficient part in your book, you have this beautiful section that you talk about unmasking self-sufficiency. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm sorry, I don't remember what I said in that part of the book. You
I can
sent
help
me a
you.
question about, give me a prompt and then I'll jump in.
Well, what you talked about was when it comes to self-sufficiency and unmasking it, it often comes out in prayerlessness, forgetfulness, anger, and the trivial. So do you think that it can happen quickly in our finances?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with self-sufficiency, I think when you're not able to give, it shows that you're relying on your finances to make you feel secure in life. And we need money to live. That's true. But it's amazing to me how often we will pray the Lord's Prayer saying, give us this day our daily bread. But it not occur to us that if we have more than our own daily bread, it's very likely that we're intended to be the source of someone else's. That prayer is actually answered by the one praying it when we recognize that if we have more than we need for today, then we have enough to give to someone else. And I think until you can give it away, you can't honestly say that you're not controlled by it, that you have control of it, that you have the control of the money. The money has control of you. And self-sufficiency creeps up on us because in the American way of thought, self-sufficiency is a virtue, not a vice. And wow. I'm all for the healthy form of self-sufficiency. Like there is a form of self-sufficiency which we would just call being a mature adult, right? Being able to manage your own business.
That's adulting, yes.
Yeah, that's different than what we're talking about. We're talking about, I don't need anything from anyone else. I can, and so much of it is like mitigating risk. It's hedging against uncertainty. And again, this doesn't mean that you don't have a life insurance plan or that you don't plan for the future, but it's a question of motive. And it's a question of how much time and energy is this taking up in your life? Like how much of your energy and time are you devoting to making sure that your storehouse is full against the day of shortage and not being mindful that there are those around you who have an empty table today?
I think you're spot on. And it does show up. I mean, I counsel literally thousands of people about their finances. And I can see it's very easy for us to get forgetful, like why we're here. Like it's not to build our own kingdom. It's not to continue storing up months and years of daily worth portions of bread, but it's to just pray to the Lord that, hey, I just need my daily bread. And I think it's Proverbs 32, don't quote me, but where, the book of Proverbs says, don't give me too much riches that I just become forgetful of you and don't need you, God. On the other hand, don't give me so much poverty that I say something ill against God. And I think we need to go back to it's daily bread. It's not monthly bread. It's not yearly bread. I do want to talk about how this unmasking self-sufficiency shows up in the rich young ruler, because this podcast is a play on the words of the rich young ruler. It's rich, young, and powerful. And if we look at the rich young ruler, I think there's a study right there where he's like, I have kept all of these things. Like you can see the self-sufficiency in his language. Like I've kept all these things. I got it covered mentality. Do you think that's alive and well in America in the 21st century?
Yeah, he doesn't just understand earning in the literal sense. He understands it in the spiritual sense. He believes he can earn spiritual capital through his obedience. And what Jesus is doing, throughout the Gospels, and in that story in particular, is he's showing law-abiding people who believe they obey God's law, that they haven't obeyed at all because they have right motive. Because they have right action, but they haven't attached right motive to it. And so I don't doubt that when the rich young ruler says that he's done all of those things, that he has. But what Jesus very quickly points out to him is that he has performed those things with the wrong motive. He's done it to self-elevate, which is evident the minute that he says, hey, go and sell all of your things. Because in that moment, the rich young ruler betrays that not only has he failed at the heart of the law, he has not passed even the first commandment to have no other gods before God. So he's just said, I've obeyed all 10, and Jesus then gives him an object lesson to show that he hasn't even obeyed the first one.
I love that perspective.
Yeah, your title of your podcast scared me half to death. I was like, wait, what are we talking about?
What did I just get invited on? It is a bait and switch. It is. I don't apologize that it's a bait and switch. People come here and they're like, well, I was looking for something else and I got the opposite. I do want to talk about self-sufficiency and how it shows up with our relationship with other believers. And I felt like this section was really convicting. You talked about that this self-sufficiency shows up in a believer's life in the avoidance of Christian community. Like, hey, I don't need my church. I don't need my connect group. Concealment. You talked about lack of accountability, lack of humility, and exhaustion. Can you talk to any of those, how that you've seen that play out teaching others?
Yeah, that first one in particular, I think is really showing all of its ugliness right now, especially post-COVID. Most Christians that I know think that the most important aspect of their faith is their personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That the most significant time they can spend in the scriptures is during their quiet time when it's just them and their Bible and the Holy Spirit. That the most important interactions that happen are just them and God. And really what this is, and not to diminish the significance of an individual relationship, but I think we've had the emphasis on the wrong syllable for a while. Because there's actually no such thing as a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, strictly speaking, because to be saved into relationship with Christ is to be brought into relationship with the church. The Big C church, the church, dating all the way back to its beginning, the church stretching forward to the return of Christ, the church that's in your local context. And what we've seen on the other side of COVID is that people attended church virtually and thought that was the same thing as being together in their local church. They didn't understand that there is an embodied church that we are a part of, and that church encourages us because it shows us our shared belief, but that it also rebukes us when we need to be rebuked. It cautions us when our belief is wandering toward an individual expression instead of perhaps a historic expression. So, one of the other ways that we're seeing this is in the massive disconnect that people have with Orthodox belief. Increasingly, Christians cannot articulate the basics of the Christian faith. Evangelical Christians who fumble the question, was Jesus fully God and fully man, and things like that. And so that's alarming to see. And it shows that we have said, my time, just me and the Lord is all that I need. And that's actually contra to what the scriptures themselves teach. People didn't return to church after COVID. They've slipped into a consumeristic approach to the way that they think about being a Christian, and deconstruction, I think, is another indicator that this is happening. I have a lot of compassion, I always like to say, for the person who's deconstructing. I think it's always tied to personal hurt, usually church hurt. But when you think that you have found a loophole or a flaw in a faith that is several millennia old, and it's sufficient enough for you to walk away after, reading some articles or reading some books, that tells me that you don't have good dialogue partners. You don't know other Christians who you can go to and sit with and say, I'm really wrestling with this question. Are there any good answers out there? Because the soul-sucking question only stays soul-sucking when we don't go to someone else and say, hey, this is what I'm confronting. And so I think when we think about what self-sufficiency looks like within Christianity, I think we have a very just me and my Bible and God mentality too often that has translated into a faith that is not grounded in what is historic and proven. One generation tells the next of the wonderful works of the Lord, but we're more and more disconnected even from our current generation of believers.
I think you're spot on. And I think that's why it's important. Like my church recently, I thought it was like, oh, this is, interesting. Like we were reciting the Apostles' Creed for a few weeks in a row. And I thought, what's the point of this? And then when you start seeing like the Holy Universal Church, and you see that sentence in there, it's like, oh, let us remember, like, this is a historic thing that we're a part of. Like, this Apostles' Creed has been a part since day one. And it's important to remember that Holy Universal Church is in there. And it also will help those who are struggling with, like, why should I give to my local church? And why can't I just give to St. Jude's or this charity? And that's not sufficient. It's like, well, if you understood you were connected to a local church, which is what you were designed, not to be a solo Lone Ranger Christian, but you're involved in a local church, you'll see that, hey, this church is the hands and feet and the bride of Christ, and it's something to give towards. And these are your friends and your family that we're given towards. And I think that's why people are asking this question, like, why should I tithe? Why should I give to my local church? It's because there is that self-sufficiency nature that is creeping in that we just need to talk to and talk regularly about.
Well, and even a disconnect between the significance of the local church in its own community, right? Because if our collective giving to our local church then has the ability to have a particular impact on our neighborhood and our community, that's a big deal. And that's something that's more than I'd be able to accomplish with just my gift. And so recognizing that we're meant to be the body, that we're supposed to all do our part to have an influence, not just on those who are attending the church, but on our community and on our town and on our state and on our nation and on the world. It changes the way that we think about what we can do together versus what we can do alone.
Exactly. There is another quality I want to go over is eternal. Like that was one of those where I was like, well, of course, God's
I know
eternal.
that one.
Yeah, I got that one. I don't have nothing to learn. And so then you open deeper, you're like, oh, okay. So this was really good. And so the rich young ruler comes to Jesus looking for what only God is and what only God can offer us. Anything that you think that is often missed with this quality of God and how that can, of course, change how we look at our finances too?
Sure. I mean, we have a saying, time is money. And God's relationship to time is that he is not bound by it. And so therefore God is never late and he's never early. He's never in a hurry. All of the experiences that we have in being bound by time, he does not experience because he exists outside of time. But he has ordained that we would exist within time. And so I think there are two ways that we can behave as though we have eternality in a way that is only attributable to God. And I just want to clarify, the Christian receives eternal life, but we still have a starting point. We have an endless horizon, but we had a starting point. And God was and is to come. He has no beginning and he has no end. And so, when we think about our relationship to time, you have people who are lazy, and the lazy person always thinks there will be more time. And then you have people who are always crazy busy, and those people think that there will never be enough time. And both of those people are telling a lie, because the God who established time gives just enough time for the things that we are given to do, the works that he's ordained for us to do. And so another way that we can do this is, if you've ever known someone who was stuck in the past, they couldn't get over their past, or maybe you've known someone who was so future oriented that they couldn't be present in the present. And both of those are ways that we try to be somewhere that only God is. Only God is in the past and the present and the future. And, you think about how in the book of James, he talks about, don't say, I'm going to do this next year. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. And you have sufficient trouble for the day. And so when we think about what we're supposed to do with our money, again, people run to the extremes and they're like, so then I shouldn't save anything. It's like, no, you actually know that's not true. Like, I don't even want to entertain that. That kind of interaction, I'm like, what's going on here. The question is, are you trying to feel like you don't have to pray? You don't have to ask the Lord for anything because you've already got it. Are you trying to put yourself in a position where you even forget to pray because it's all fine right now? Everything's great. And when we think about our relationship to time, I do think we have to ask, which one am I? And I think most of us are a mix. We're lazy in some areas and we're overly busy in other areas. And then to ask, what lie am I telling myself about time? And what does God say is true about time? Time is a non-renewable resource. And so in many ways, it's not just money, it's more valuable than money. Because people who maybe don't have actual money to give can give time. And so it's something that is given to all of us. Not all of us receive financial wealth, but all of us receive 24 hours in a day. And we never know how many days we will have. So when you think about, the words of Moses in Psalm 90, he says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And so a lot of what we're doing when we think about wealth, time is a wealth. That's why the scriptures speak of gray hair as being something that we should aspire to, because it means you've been given a wealth of days. And the way that we spend that wealth, whether it's to make money that we can use to help others, or whether it is to take the time that we have to help others, that non-renewable resource is meant not to just terminate on me and my self-actualization. It is meant for me to be a benefit to others in my family, in my community. It's meant to be a life that's poured out in service.
Well, you gave us a really thought-provoking question: is where are we living too much into, and where we're lying to ourselves? Oftentimes, talking with families about investing for the future, saving for the future. So many times, it's always living in the future, and it can be difficult for someone that is a good saver, that's naturally good with numbers, or naturally good with seeing the power of compound interest, or just happens to be, it's easier to them to not be, because. And oftentimes we marry the opposite, right? Like, I'm naturally maybe a saver, and my spouse maybe naturally not. And in my case, I'm very blessed. She's not a big spender, but it wasn't too hard for her. But we marry opposites, and so that can be hard even enter a marriage. Yeah. But living in the present is, it was very convicting for me. It's like, all right, how am I living so far in the future that I need to start living more in the present? Because if you're not careful, especially for someone like me that tends to live in the future, I'm looking at other people's future too. Like, I'm looking at all these other entrepreneurs, all these other business people that are 10, 20, 30 years ahead. And you're like, well, I want what they want. And before you know it, you are coveting in a very serious way, and envying what, took them 30 years. And again, or is not even your journey at all.
Yes. Well, and I have no doubt that you use this example regularly, but Jesus did understand the time value of money. I mean, he tells the parable of the talents, and obviously that parable is about way more than just money. Right. But we see in that it is appropriate to think about a future return. It is, but that future return is one that we want to present to the Lord. And so it's thinking about your money and anything else that's been entrusted to you, and asking, how can I multiply this for the sake of the kingdom?
Yeah, it's definitely about balance, and making sure that we live in balance, and not thinking too much of the past, present, or future, because God is in all of those. I mean, I think about when they came to Jesus asking to settle the accounts between this financial discrepancy, and he's like, I'm not trying to be a judge here. I'm trying to talk about the kingdom to come, where I will be a judge. Immutable. I want to talk about that quality. I've spent my life trying to help give families financial security. I literally named my company Swan Capital, sleep well at night. So I want to give them this financial security, or, peace of mind with their finances. But finances can change in no time. In the snap of a finger, it can change. How is the words always and never so insidious?
Well, I mean, relationally, they're insidious, because as soon as we get into a fight with someone, those are the words that we like to employ. I mean, usually the people that we know the best, right? We feel like we have the most freedom to say, you never pick your socks up. They're always on the bathroom floor. Every time I bring this up, you say X, Y, or Z. And so we use a lot of superlatives. And when we do that, we're actually ascribing to another human being what is only true of God. You think about 1 Corinthians 13, we've all heard it a million times at weddings, and it says all of the things that love always does and love never does, right? And you hear it read at a wedding, and I'm enough of a cynic where I'm like, okay, that'll go great for you two adorable kids. And the reason that, I get that little giggle is because we can pretty quickly forget that the kind of love that's described there is actually not human love at all. It's a supernatural. It's agape love. Now, right. It becomes a love we're capable of once we are in Christ, which is why we say it at wedding ceremonies. It's actually a really great thing to say. But it's fascinating to me that when we bring accusation against the people that we are in arguments with, especially the people who are closest to us, that we immediately default to saying you always and you never. And the thing is humans are just not that consistent. We sometimes, and we occasionally, or we very frequently, or we with great regularity, but we don't always or never. And it shows that a weak argument underlies whatever it is that the accuser is saying, that they felt the need to amplify it to godlike status. But God is the one who doesn't change, and He's the fixed point on the ever moving horizon that we cling to. And gosh, with the stock market, anywhere you're going to put your money, you don't know what's going to happen, and you might be able to have
It'll
some
sprout
educated
wings.
guesses. Yeah,
It can sprout wings, like
sprout wings
Proverbs
and fly.
says.
Yeah, and you could do everything right according to the formula, and find out that the payoff wasn't there in the end, which is why ultimately our trust has to be in the Lord. So I think that I'm a person who hates change. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. That was the hardest chapter for me to write because it was the one where I was most in danger of being a total hypocrite, because I want to be like God. I jokingly say that the reason I never want things to change is just because I love that God does not change so much, but that's not true. It is something in me that lacks trust. And so we do what we can see to be right as far as we can see the facts that we have, but we're not omniscient. We don't hold all the facts. We're not actually held accountable for holding all the facts. We're held accountable for taking the information we have and making the best decision that we can in the moment. That's actually what biblical wisdom is. And so that's different. That's different than what most people are praying for when they pray for wisdom. Like most people, when they bow their heads and say, Lord, I just need wisdom because I need to figure out how to do X, Y, or Z. They're not asking for wisdom. They're asking for knowledge. They want to be told what to do. That's a big difference. And when you recognize that you're praying to an immutable God who holds all knowledge, and He's not worried about your individual decision, He's worried about who you are on the other side of it way more than He is about whether you made the quote best decision or not. It changes the way you think about everything. Certainly changes the way that you think about the money that you've been given. I hope that it frees people up to do their best with the money that they have, and not feel like whatever the results are either an indictment that they're terrible, or that they are proof that they are actually better than everybody else.
Well, thank you for being so transparent that was the chapter you had so much conviction over. This next one is a good transition because I felt a lot of conviction with this one. Is sovereign. I've experienced zero gravity is when, I've dethroned, God from his throne in my life and said, oh, I can take it from here. I can be independent. And I've experienced zero gravity because you start losing your sense of the ground, and everything just starts spinning out of control because you're not supposed to be at the center of the universe. And that's when I've experienced that. So, we're steeped in independence here in the United States. Democracy is in our blood, and we don't like to be told, commanded, or we don't like to give up easily our control. Sovereign really is foreign to us. How does, our control of our possessions really butt up against God's sovereignty?
Well, of course, it relates to time again, because our possession, if time is money, and money buys me possessions, then I'm going to devote my time to making money to buy myself possessions. And the possessions, are going to show me whether I'm successful or not. And if you think about how often the Bible laces the Sabbath principle into so many areas of life, it makes sense, because if we stop our labor for any period of time, we have to face the reality that we weren't keeping the world spinning on its axis. That's really the primary function of Sabbath, is to say loud and clear, you are not God. Right. And we don't love that. And that's why I think we see, everybody's addicted to caffeine.
Well, I heard it this way, that, God actually every 24 hours takes the most powerful people in the world and puts them in a fetal position as a baby and puts them to sleep, just to show them that they're not that all powerful.
Yeah. And I think the way that we feel about having to take a break says a lot about whether we believe that we're sovereign or we believe that God is sovereign. And a funny way that I think this plays out in a lot of our lives is like, if you've ever left a job, like you're moving on to what's next. And as you're walking out the door with your box full of your belongings, you're looking around at all of your colleagues and you're thinking to yourself, I give it a week and this whole place is just going to fall apart, and then like you get together with someone maybe a month later and you're like, so how's it going? And they're like, good, we hired Jimmy. He's doing your role now. He seems like a great guy. Things are rolling right along. And it really messes with our sense of our own self-importance and,
Sure.
what it was that we thought that we were we were in control of. I mean, really, you should be able to leave a job and think this will continue on, as though I were still there. That would show, I think, that you were performing your duties in a way that was open-handed and that you didn't need something from.
I mean, it's so true. I mean, I've sat down with many retirees and they're like, again, no one, this happened 2 weeks ago. The guy said it 3 or 4 times and his wife did not roll her eyes, but I could tell she was stunned by what he was saying. They can't do it without me.
Yeah.
They can't do it without me.
Yeah.
Multiple times I'm like, I
Yeah.
didn't want to
And
say they will step
wrong,
right
then.
over you.
Yeah. If that's true, you did it wrong.
True, because if you're working unto the Lord, like they should be
Yeah.
a great organization that doesn't have to need you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we have it, or we do it with our families. We think that we created and sustained our children, therefore we're sovereign over their decisions. I think that plays out in helicopter parenting in all kinds of ways, or where we have to self-actualize through a child. And anytime you dip your toe into the pond of I'm going to be sovereign, you're going to ask or require things of other humans that they're not built for. It won't just be that you're not built for what you're asking of yourself. You'll do the same thing to other people as well.
Well, if you can't tell already, it was a fantastic book. And, those were some of the qualities that I definitely wanted to chat and, give it a different lens and talk about generosity and philanthropy. What are you working on right now? Or what do you got coming up?
I'm trying to get up the nerve to put together a manuscript on aging. I have a lot of thoughts about aging, and I figured I should do it before I'm, shriveled up and 75, and everybody thinks I'm just writing it to prove a point. I'm here. I'm still close enough to midlife that I'm having thoughts about, giving care for my parents, and at the same time, grandchildren. Like I had one day where I got 2 texts right in a row. One was, hey, your dad fell again. And the other was, baby Jeffrey started walking. So we have one who's stopping walking and one who's starting walking. And that's the shape of life, right? Is it
that's the complete spectrum right there. I mean, you really are being sandwiched between multiple generations right there.
So I think the Bible has a lot to say about that. So I'm trying to get up the nerve to write on that. And then I'll have a study on the book of Joshua that's going to come out.
Oh, wow. I will say that's going to be a very controversial one, especially Western versus Eastern, thoughts towards family and generations. Like, again, I'm in the weeds with families talking about long-term care. And, we're just going to put mom here. And it's like, well, I mean, for thousands of years, they didn't do that. But, there's consequences with that. That maybe you'll miss out on some of the memories, the last memories you have with your parents because they were with someone else that was taking care of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting how my parents' generation believed that they should not become a burden to their children. I mean, my mother believed it until her dying day. She did not want us to have to take on her care. That would have been a sign of failure. And yet I kept trying to say to her, but Mom, when I was an infant, and you were caring for me, you didn't resent it. You didn't see it as an imposition on you. You knew that it was part of the natural shape of life. And she would always say, I'm so sorry you have to take me to the doctor. And I kept saying to her, hey, you're a person to love, not a problem to solve, But I think that when we don't connect the end of life to the beginning of life, and I would argue you can connect all those intermediate stages too, that's kind of what I want to write about in this book. Then we begin to understand caregiving at end of life through similar lenses to caregiving at the beginning of life. And I think it changes the way that we do the math.
Oh, that's so good. Well, I look forward to reading that. Where can people find some of your teachings, your books? Where would you send those who maybe have heard of your work but not read it fully and would like to jump right into the Jen Wilkin universe?
You can find all of the books and Bible studies on my website, jenwilkin.net. And I mean, pretty much if you just Google my name at this point, you can find things that I've taught on YouTube. If you don't want to buy anything, you want to see something without having to pay for it, which I totally understand. You should be able to find things. There's a lot of stuff through the Gospel Coalition. A lot of my former teachings are out there available to listen to. And then we have a podcast. I have a podcast talking about everyday theology with my 2 friends, JT English and Kyle Worley, called Knowing Faith. And we intend to not just talk about theology, but show people the beauty of discussing theology and Bible literacy in community with other believers.
I love that. That's such a need. It's such a need. Like if you're not careful, we can be led astray, and we can be shepherded by wolves if we're not careful. If we don't know our own doctrine very well that we're following and believing in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a blast. Well, again, go check out some of her books ASAP. Again, None Like Him was amazing, and I really have encouraged others to read it. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm so glad to do it.
All righty.